Hey, look at that. We're live on YouTube again. Awesome. So hey, everyone who's tuning in for today's episode of Emancipatory Education Now, welcome back. We're here for episode 5 today, I believe, and Anna is going to lead us in a conversation around anti-racist education. So take it away, Anna.
Thank you so much, Brian. And thank you to everybody who's tuning in right now to, I guess you would call this a webcast. And thank you to my co-host for being here. I'm very excited to where this is going to take us. I specifically decided to do this topic today because, unfortunately, in the past few weeks, we've seen that there's been a rise in anti-Asian hate crimes. And I wanted to, at times like these, it's very important that we commit to standing up against racism in our communities. And I think part of that, as educators, part of that is anti-racist education and teaching our students and teaching the next generation about how they can be good citizens and how they can respect other people. And thinking about how our policies, are, either potentially racist or how we can make them more anti-racist and the sort of biases in the education system. Because racism isn't necessarily something that's just going to go away without us thinking about it. We have to be actively working towards that every single day. So, we're going to be talking today about what does anti-racist education look like? What are the different things that we can do to promote anti-racist education? And, why is it important specifically in today's society? So before this session, I asked my fellow co-hosts to read 2 articles and then also watch a short video. So I wanted to start us off by asking, what was your initial reactions to what we had to look at? Did anything surprise you? Did you have any thoughts, feelings that you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, I can go first. I think I want to say thank you for bringing our attention to this topic, because I feel like it's a very important topic to be talking about, especially since the rise of anti-Asian or American anti-Asian and Pacific Islander violence has been really really occurring throughout California. I feel that so I tend to have a so my practice or my background is in sociology, so I tend to be biased and tend to view social inequality through a social perspective. So what stood out to me was the concept of othering, and what I mean by that is by the creation of certain labels and categories that tend to other individuals as to make so that mistreatment and a lack of resources and opportunities can be justified, basically, because they don't fit the typical image of what it means to be a quote unquote American. They tend to face a lot of discrimination and exclusion from society. So yeah, but I would also like to hear what the rest of my colleagues have to say.
I really love that you brought up othering, and I think it's particularly appropriate when we're looking at the article around how the federal government at one point, not now, banned any diversity kind of training. I think the messaging around, well, let me just start over. This wasn't surprising, right? It's not surprising. What is interesting is, and this is not the only article I've seen, it is the kind of the resistance to the 1619 project in particular, which has not really brought to light, but is providing a narrative that isn't there in typical US history books about the bringing over of African Americans and the enslavement of Africans, and how much contestation there is to the truth of it. So all the statements that are coming out against it are saying, it's not true. And they're throwing all these words at it. Critical race theory is problematic. There's all of this language that's just trying to push it away. And if you peel back all the language, you can tell that the writers, the people who are putting the articles out, don't really understand critical race theory. They probably haven't even read the 1619 Project, but it's just this blaring resistance to understanding more truth to history. And I think that's a huge proponent of othering, where where there is a denial of people and their culture. And I think that's very prevalent, not only in terms of the 1619 Project, but in relation to AAPI hate and erasure. So if we think about the racialized experience of people in the United States, we have to think, Asian Americans experience America differently, African Americans experience America differently, and part of what's happening for our Asian American community is a complete erasure of who they are. And so I think that goes hand in hand with the othering. We other people in the way that we create a narrative around them. We erase and deny who they are and their history. And then it's no wonder that there's so much violence and hate against different people.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Abby. I think you and Victor brought up othering. I think that's a really important concept, and we can't really ignore that. And I really loved how you said about, people denying cultures and races. I think that's really prevalent. So thank you for bringing that up. And, for me personally, my initial reaction was I was a little shocked after reading the articles, because we don't really hear about anti-racist education. At least I haven't, in popular news outlets and in our classes and in our courses, at least the courses that I took. So it was really interesting to read more about it. And I know we're going to talk about the diversity programs and the critical race theory in accordance to Trump's orders a bit later on. But for me, that was personally very frustrating to read, specifically that article, because I felt like colleges were kind of forced into canceling diversity programs because they didn't want their colleges to lose funding. And I feel like diversity is such a huge part of society, and it allows us to learn about people's experiences and stories. So if we're not given the opportunity to be mindful of diversity, there really isn't any way we can learn what is offensive to a group of people and how we can effectively respect those around us. And I was also surprised that, again, that this issue didn't come out in the open as much. I mean, there's obviously news stories about the pandemic and incidents around the world that might have been given more importance, but I think it's also important to research how our administration is handling education, how different districts in our nation are handling education, and what changes the administration is making. And another point that I wanted to bring up was the videos about the 6 ways to be an anti-racist educator. I found that really interesting because there's so many different techniques you can use in the classroom, but sometimes it can be difficult to implement them. So it just allowed me to think about how we can effectively implement the techniques and if it is possible in a classroom setting.
Yeah, I just want to, I agree with all 3 of you and what you said. And I do want to add that, like Vaishnavi, I felt really frustrated reading about it as well. Like everything I think that you just see going on right now is really frustrating, but also like Abby said, I'm not surprised. And the statistics that I saw were not surprising. They were just really disappointing. One thing that stood out to me was that they were saying a lot of the anti-Asian hate going on in schools and also in colleges are going unnoticed, and a lot of the incidents are going underreported and might as well be happening under the radar. And that's really just like shocking to see and kind of really like frustrating because, you know, you're in a community or you're in a space like college or school where you're supposed to feel safe, and these incidents are not being reported. And it's just really like surprising to see that while a lot of colleges and administrations are working hard to, you know, create a safe space, it's not, a lot of these incidents are still going on. Additionally, the first article we read about anti-Asian incidents, someone said that people may try to undermine the incidents or by saying that certain groups have strong educational and socioeconomic success, but they shouldn't forget that all the pain and the suffering these individuals experience in a society that, you know, was structured over centuries to help like white people succeed rather than. It was very like interesting, and I think that goes along with the topic of othering too, to see how over centuries these groups of people have been othered and you know, like just discriminated against.
Yeah, I think I'm going to echo everybody when I say I was also frustrated and a little bit, it was a little bit disheartening to do this kind of research, I found. I really liked, Abby and Victor, the points you brought up about othering. You know, it connects really nicely with what we were talking about way back when we started decolonizing education, you know, when we talked about othering and how that, you know, causes all these biases in education. And it's the same thing here, you know, anti-racist education fits in with this idea that we need to decolonize education. It's an extension of that, I think. And also, Aminah, I really liked the point you brought up about how, you know, a lot of times these crimes aren't going reported, you know, or they're, you know, where people are trying to cover them up or they don't want to think about that, you know, and Abby, you too made that point about how, you know, people don't want diversity programs sometimes because they don't want to think about that. They don't want to have to talk about these difficult issues. And I think, you know, yes, these issues are not easy things to talk about, and they can be very, very difficult, and you have to talk about them with a lot of nuance, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be shedding light on them, because at the end of the day, they're not going to go away. They're just going to get worse. And so we need to, you know, be brave enough to really discuss and have these difficult conversations with each other. Moving on, I just wanted to ask everybody, how would you define anti-racist education? And you can base this off of, you know, your readings of the articles or the video, or, you know, also just your personal experience and opinion. What do you think anti-racist education is?
I'll go ahead and start. For me personally, I think anti-racist education is either as a student or the teacher informing yourself and others about other people's cultures and their experiences as well as yours. So everyone has a similar understanding. I know that as I was reading the article, I was reading how they were saying that ethnic studies classes or just changing the curriculum should flow cohesively between kindergarten through 12, along with community colleges and colleges as well. And I think something that stood out to me about anti-racist education is I think it should be cohesive throughout your whole education experience. It shouldn't be one course you take in high school or one course or a lesson you have. I think it should be something that is implemented throughout your whole curriculum, because it is something that it's a lot. It's not just one thing you learn and, you know, you keep going. It's implemented through each subject and through each experience you have. And then additionally, like in order for everyone to understand like the root of the problem and to really understand anti-racist education, I think it's understanding the stereotypes of people have of others and the racism and discrimination and overall just the history of it as well. And just really mainly educating students from the beginning, not just in college or in.
Yeah, I agree with you, Aminah. And I really like how you brought up cohesiveness, because a lot of times we do learn about different types of incidents, like racist incidents happening in the United States and around the world in specific times in class, like we have a specific chapter dedicated to that, and then we just never look back. So I think it's important to have that continuation throughout your whole school career so that you pay attention to what's going on around you and you're knowledgeable about what is going on. So for me personally, I think I would define anti-racist education as kind of like a movement to break down the systems of oppression and stereotypes that we have in society towards colored individuals. And I feel like it's a type of education for not only students, but also for educators to learn more about the adversities that colored minorities face and being mindful about what they go through while they teach. So in the video that Anna shared, I think her name is Dina Simmons. She says that anti-racist education kind of coexists with being culturally sensitive and being student-centered. And I think ultimately the goal of anti-racist education is to teach according to the students in the room. So connecting history and concepts to what students experience in their own life so that students are more engaged and can learn more. I think that's ultimately the goal of anti-racist education. It's connecting it to the students and making sure that we are accounting, or we're holding everybody accountable and learning from each other while we interact with each other.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone said. For me, I'm gonna take a little different perspective. I feel like what anti-racist education, well, the concept is very dense. I feel like throughout K to 12, the vision of anti-racist education is gonna differ. It's gonna look different. It's going to need to be different because I feel as you know, as youth are socialized into this into society, they their ability to their cognitive ability is still not fully developed. So their ability to grasp concepts is not fully present, not fully developed. And as time goes on, I feel that the the types of practices that are quote unquote anti-racist education need to transform as well as we go further on through education. But I feel like what anti-racist education would look like is, I want to bring it back to the beginning of our of this whole entire web series about decolonization. I feel that it's important to grasp the reality that race, like a lot of other I guess identifying characteristics, are they're constructs. They are constructed by us. We give them value. We reinforce them. We put a value on them. So if we put value on them, then that means we can also take it away. So would it what would it it would look like, helping students to decolonize their minds, and also learn to silence the ego in a way not to act biased towards students or to anyone in general. I feel that it would look like efforts to try to steer students away from staying within inside the boundaries. I feel like it would look like increasing compassion, empathy, and understanding, as was told by my fellow co-host. But I also feel that I feel a strong connection towards decolonization of these constructs, that keep us differentiated. keep us from unifying. They keep us separated. And I believe that yeah, we should our efforts to try to help students support learning how to hold their ego in check, learning how to not be biased, not be stereotypical, not mistreat others because of their race, their ethnicity, their gender, their sex, any identifying characteristic. Um, I feel, yeah, and I would like to hear what the rest of my co-hosts have to say too.
Victor, I really appreciate your comments around how race and other dimensions of difference are a tool for stratifying people and creating a hierarchy of who's good and who's bad, and who's valued and who's not valued. I think in addition to the comments that are already being made, really to know what anti-racist education is, you have to also have a clear understanding of racist education is and what racism is, right? I think as a country collectively, we're really good at pointing out like the very overt racist acts, right? Like if there's a racial slur involved, if there are other kind of tangible markers like swastika tattoos, or if someone says like, I hate X group of people, then we can label racism real easily. But you know, when it's more subtle, when we don't immediately see how there's a racialized experience in something, you know, for instance, housing, redlining has become a kind of popular topic, hot topic now, but for so long, we saw it as this neutral ground where people just buy houses. If they could, they could. If they couldn't, they couldn't. And there wasn't really light to if race or gender or any of these other markers were playing a role in whether people had access to that. So expanding our notion of how we see racism and understanding that it's not just like when people are wearing the white hoods, that's the racist piece, but that there are so many different crevices in our lives where racism, white supremacy, and the magnet to hold on to whiteness exist in our lives. And when we can kind of peel back some of that and kind of see like, okay, well, when I have, or when we're doing standardized tests, we're like, what part of white supremacy are we upholding when we say we have to do it right now in this moment? Or when I put all of my students in rows in a classroom, how am I upholding industrialized education from way back in the past that maybe does not even apply? So in addition to all the comments that are being made, I think at the heart is really taking into reflection, where in our school systems are there racist tendencies that go beyond just the violence that we see and we know as, that's definitely racist, but how can we educate ourselves to understand that there's all these other pieces?
I'm seeing a common sort of theme in many of these answers, which is that, that we have to think about, the pieces that don't immediately come to our attention. Like Abby was saying, think about the little pieces, the things that we don't notice might be racist or might be influenced by some sort of bias. I think that that's a really important part of anti-racist education. When I was thinking about this, that was what came to mind, is thinking you can't assume that the education system is neutral. You can't assume that we're starting in a neutral place. You have to assume that there's already bias there, and you have to go looking for that bias, and you have to think about ways in which you can get rid of that bias or push against that bias for your students. I think that's really, really important. And it's something that I'm really having to think about because we would like to think that everything is sort of neutral. And so it's just as easy as not being racist. But I don't think that that is the case, unfortunately. I think that there's much more work involved. And I really like what you said, Victor, about how it needs to look different across different grade levels. I think that that's something that's really important, is thinking about, how as kids grow up, how are they learning the sort of norms and values of our society? And how do we have to adjust our education to meet our kids where they're at on a social emotional level, on a developmental level, so that we can teach them, because, racism isn't something that it's not inherent, obviously, it's something that you learn from society. And so how do we counter that narrative?
If I could just add one more thing,
Mhm.
and I know that the co-hosts on this panel believe this, but maybe some of the viewers out there need to hear it too. There's no age that is too young to learn about anti-racism, right? Of course, Victor and Anna have emphasized it's going to look different, but every child has an understanding of what fairness is. So how can we, build upon that at a kind of foundational level for our youngest of learners, and then grow to a deeper understanding of how we can be advocates for all people and make sure that everyone feels safe and welcome and have a sense of belonging. So I think that's one of the questions that comes up from teachers and parents, like is it too young to talk about racism? Is it too young to get into some of these sticky topics? And the answer is no. You may not be speaking to them about these topics, but they're absorbing it through media, they're absorbing it through their friends, through in your family scenarios and instances. And so they're seeing it. And if they're seeing it, they can also learn about it.
Thank you for bringing that up, Abby. I really appreciate you clarifying that. I think that's a really valuable point to keep in mind as we go forward throughout the rest of this conversation. Our next question is, and we've been touching on this in bits and pieces, what do you think are anti-racist strategies for teachers, specifically at the classroom level, because we're going to move on to the district and the school level a little bit later. And, these can be based off, the video that we looked at gave very sort of concrete strategies. So these can be based off that, or again, just your personal experience, your personal understanding of anti-racist education. What are strategies that teachers can be looking to implement in their classrooms?
So I think I could go ahead and get started on this. I really appreciate the video because I was trying to think of some topics and techniques, but I really couldn't think of that many techniques because I was like, it is a really difficult thing to implement. But I think what stood out to me in the video, one of the strategies, again, that Dina Simmons kind of mentioned was learning with your crew. And I really liked that because I feel like anti-racist education can not be possible without like the cooperation of everyone involved. And ultimately you are learning from each other. So as each student shares what they go through, they're able to educate their peers at the same time. And another strategy that really stood out to me was asking students what they need. So I feel like in any career or job, like constructive criticism is one of the key actions for people to perform better. So in the same way, I think asking students what they need help with, and if their educators are doing a good job helping them understand more about their community is really important and beneficial. So yeah, I think the two strategies, particularly from the video, was learning along with your team, with your class, and also asking students directly what they need instead of just assuming that they got everything under control.
I think those two strategies you mentioned were definitely stood out to me as well, like learning from others and asking students what they need. And then I think a third one that stood out to me was becoming self-aware and just realizing if you have any biases starting in this, because in the video, Dina Simmons mentioned that you have to view what you're teaching and the curriculum you're teaching from an anti-bias and an anti-racist lens, and you have to just be aware if you're coming in with any biases, which I think is a good reminder because we would all like to think that we don't have any biases, but we might have some stuff in the back of our head. We want to just double check and make sure we're being inclusive for everyone. So I thought that was really interesting. And she said, to view what you're teaching from a cultural responsive lens, and don't pose your own values or your own biases on the curriculum if you are writing the curriculum or any lessons you're teaching. And it's just important to be really self-aware. And that just definitely stood out to me, because I think that is a big step. You have to be self-aware before you begin to learn from others as well and teach others.
Yeah, I was going to say, I love that you brought up the self-awareness piece. Because what I'm seeing, particularly anytime, it's a new group's turn, right? A new group's turn for racism. We had George Floyd, now we're having AAPI. So when events happen, what I see on social media are giant lists of, here are the books to read, here's some curriculum, here's a lesson you can teach in your classroom. And then people asking, what book should I buy for my class? I can't underscore enough, though, how important it is to do the self-reflection piece, even before you start to buy books and you start to kind of put it into your curriculum, for two reasons. One, a new curriculum doesn't mean you're teaching a different way. If you're not examining who you are and understanding where you're coming in from and what lens you're bringing into the classroom, then the vehicle that you teach through won't change that. And so you might have all the great chapter books, but you might be reading it through a lens that is problematic. Second, I think it's really important to kind of look inward first, because if this is the first time you're thinking about Black students because of George Floyd, or Asian American students because of this new rise of AAPI violence, people from these communities will tell you that the harm to their communities has been existing for a very long time. So if this is the first time you're paying attention to it, you really need to look inwardly to say, what about my experience so far in my life has prevented me from seeing it until today? And that, I think, is going to be a hard question to answer if all of this is brand new. If racism is so brand new to you, it's a 2020, came with the pandemic, if that's new to you, I think that's going to be a hard question, but it's a really important question. Is it that you need to expand your social networks? Is it that you need to do more research about your students to understand where they're coming from, their home lives, their communities? Is it that you have all these blind spots that you can fill in with more conversations with other teachers who are possibly doing this kind of work, and can help you along the way, and you can lean into that network that Dina Simmons wants you to start to build, right? So I think that's a really critical question. If today is the first time you understood that Asian Americans are experiencing harm in the country, or if it is such a blaring message to you that this is the first time you're paying attention to it, then you need to ask yourself why. Why is it happening only right now? Because it's been happening for centuries before, I guarantee.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I totally agree with everything you said. But one thing that really stood out to me is the self-reflection part. I believe that a lot of agents in education tend to have this deficit-based thinking when it comes to students, minority students. They tend to have biased perspectives that tend to just look at their deficits or look at them as not not meeting certain standards that typical students meet. I feel that deficit-based thinking or deficit-based theory in education really perpetuates the notion of othering as well. I think that what we can do is hold ourselves accountable into as agents in education, or hold agents in education accountable to be critical and then on themselves, be critical of the preconceived notions that they have surrounding stereotypical assumptions of students. I think that the most influential agent in education to a student is the teacher. I feel that and that's not just giving all pressure to the teacher as well, because a lot of evaluators tend to reinforce this deficit-based thinking when it comes to students who are not fluent in English, students who might have certain impediments or who are foreign as well, or come from outside of the United States, or so I feel that everyone in education should be held to a held under a critical lens, that they need to be conscious of of what they do, their behavior that reinforces the status quo.
Yeah, thank you for all of your responses. I really liked, Vaishnavi, what you were saying about how we need to ask students what they need. We need to make sure that we are communicating with our students, I think is a big one. I think anti-racist education is a collaborative process. And so you as the teacher have to communicate with your students, especially because they're going to have experiences that are different from your own. They're going to experience, potentially forms of racism that you don't experience, or that are different from forms that you have experienced. And so you have to establish that line of communication with your students, and you have to ask them what they need, and you have to look to that. And I really liked, this idea that we have to affirm our students' identity. I think that's also really important. And I think that Abby, you kind of touched on this when you said, that, this sort of racism is not new. It's been going on for years. And if we turn to the education system, this racism has been going on in the education system for years. The American education system has an unfortunate habit of telling students, you have to be like this in order to be successful. You have to assimilate into the mainstream culture in order to be successful. And there's no room for you to be different, for there to be diversity of cultures, of languages. Even the way students look has been policed and is still policed. And so, affirming identity and anti-racist education, I think, it really goes hand in hand, and telling students it's okay to not be like mainstream culture. No one's culture is inherently better. Looking or talking a certain way doesn't inherently make you more educated. And so affirming students' cultural identity and not forcing them to fit into a box of what, people would like to think is correct or is the appropriate way, I think is really important to anti-racist education. And I was thinking about that as you talked, Abby, because I think that it is a sort of natural connection. Why are we only talking about these things now? We shouldn't only be talking about these things now. We should be looking at the history of the education system and seeing how, it's been biased from the beginning. And so that's why it's going to take us a lot of hard work to change it. And like I said earlier, we can't assume that it's going to be neutral. So for our next question, we're going to move more to the district and the school level. The first article, I think, makes a really good point. And Victor, I think you somewhat brought this up earlier. We need to go beyond ethnic studies courses. It's not just enough to put an ethnic studies course into the curriculum and call it a day. And so we need to have anti-racist education in all subjects. So how do we think that school and districts can accomplish this on a more larger scale?
Well, at the district level, districts really love when there are standards attached to learning, right? what some teachers may not know is there's actually a framework for anti-bias and anti-racist education. And there are social justice standards that can be taught and implemented across curriculum. So that's a first step. Take a look at what those social justice standards are and see how they can apply to what you're already doing. As teachers, I know it's really difficult when people above you say like, hey, here's something new to teach and teach it tomorrow. So see wherever you can, try to implement these standards with what you're already doing to elevate what you're doing already. Second, I think taking a look at curriculum is a very kind of basic and easy step, right? When you are studying scientists and when you're studying mathematicians, anything in your classrooms, are you only focusing on the European contributions to that topic or to that field? If you are, then you're missing out on a whole history and a whole globe's worth of brilliance and people who have contributed to all of us. So if your curriculum is European centric, then the next step is to look beyond that, see where other brilliance is in the world.
I definitely agree with you, Abby. I think just that's something I've really thought about, realizing that if you're teaching one way, like a Eurocentric way, there's so much more you're missing out on. And that's definitely something really something I never thought about, that's really interesting. I think in addition, something like districts can do, as well as maybe university, administrations and people in charge as well, is in the article, they mentioned how a lot of, like we discussed earlier, a lot of violence and crimes are going unreported, but also there aren't a lot of places for students to report, any incidents, or there's not a lot of resources available. And I think that's what a lot of districts are trying to implement now, but create more support groups or more places where students can have resources and also educate themselves. Book clubs and conversations, even through Zoom and different things we can do now, because as students, if we want to educate ourselves more, we do need, a lot of students look for resources, and they look for safe environments as well. So I think in addition to providing these resources, creating safe environments where students do feel comfortable enough to report an incident or realize maybe where they're going wrong and try to unlearn their biases and grow.
Yeah, thanks, Aminah, for sharing. I was about to say something similar as well, to kind of make sure that you have resources available to students, because sometimes students do want to educate themselves, but they just don't know where to look or how to look. So I feel like maybe universities and districts could definitely help with funding for different organizations on campus, or support students in creating chapters for an organization, or creating clubs and support groups. And I was also thinking about how districts and schools can help students even when they're younger, because before we were talking about how we would implement anti-racist education when students are younger, when they might not fully understand what is going on around them. So I would say districts can start funding to call in guest speakers that have taken ethnic courses themselves or are knowledgeable about race and cultures. And I feel like just having a guest speaker talk about their experiences would be really eye-opening for children and students. So funding towards that, I think, would be really beneficial. And I think also kind of allowing teachers to put in their curriculum any group projects where students can share their ethnic customs and foods and celebrations, and kind of start implementing that everyone's different and everyone's unique in their own way from a young age. Because personally, I had a project in elementary school where we had to kind of share our background, where we're from, and it was a really memorable an educating experience for me because I was able to appreciate where everyone was from and learn more about what people went through, what their ancestors went through, and how they came to America. So I feel like just starting that from a young age, allowing teachers to be creative with their curriculum. And as Abby said, districts do love standards. So kind of being flexible and allowing teachers and educators flexibility would be really good for both the educators and the students.
I agree. Thank you for thank you to everyone who spoke. I agree with everyone as well. Let me see. How would implementing anti-racist education in all subjects look like? I feel that in order to try to implement anti-racist education in all subjects, we might need to look at the subjects themselves. We some of the subjects, there's subjects in education that really disproportionately restrict and hinder students of color, students from low resource communities. So we need to be critical of the subjects that are being offered to the students, because a lot of the subjects, like we were talking about, they perpetuate this notion of white supremacy within the academia. It's very Eurocentric. It's very it glimpse or it glides over the history of exclusion that
Victor, I don't know if you can hear this, but you're frozen right now.
really
Oh, you're
think
back.
about. Oh, hey, are you back?
You're back now, yeah.
I'm sorry about that. I must have dropped the call. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, well, I believe that we must be critical about the subjects that are being offered in schools. I feel that a lot of the subjects either um restrict, disadvantage, or hinder the the progress of students. I believe that they have been set up to disproportionately disadvantage um, students who come from low resource opportunities. Um, and I believe that a lot of the subject material perpetuates this notion of white supremacy within the academia, and as has been told already, yeah.
Thank you. I really appreciate what everyone's been saying about curriculum and also, looking at standards, even thinking about, what standards do we have that are potentially problematic or encouraging problematic ways of teaching. And then also, even outside what's being directly taught in the classroom, thinking about making safe spaces for students, funding in lectures to come and talk about these things on university campuses. I think what our responses have kind of shown is that there's a myriad of things that need to happen, and it doesn't just happen in a single classroom. It needs to happen in a school, and it needs to happen in what we have students do outside of class as well as inside class and at the district level. So it really needs to be a holistic approach. Anti-racist education is something that really needs to be holistic in order to be truly effective. We're out of time, so I'm going to move to the call to action for this episode. So our call to action is based off the video that I had all of my co-hosts watch. It's called 6 Ways to be an Anti-Racist Educator. So I would encourage you to watch that video and try to implement at least one of these strategies in your classroom. And, think about how can I, what's one thing I can do, tomorrow to be an anti-racist educator. And then also, even if you're not directly in the classroom right now, many of these ideas are applicable beyond the classroom. So think about what it would look like for you to implement these practices in your daily life. What can you do to combat racism in your community? Can you be engaging in self-reflection? Can you be reaching out to your community and asking what they need? How can you actively push back against the racism that we're seeing today? I'd like to thank my lovely co-hosts again for joining me on this conversation. I really appreciated all of your insights. And thank you to everybody that was watching. Thank you for supporting it.